Okay, so welcome everyone, and let me start by introducing our guest and a fellow Gothicist, Laura Kreml, who's an assistant professor in the English department at Niagara University, where she teaches 18th and 19th century British literature and Gothic literature. Her work explores the intersections of Gothic studies, health humanities, history of medicine, disability studies, and death studies. Her monograph, Romantic Medicine and the Gothic Imagination, Morbid Anatomies, was published in 2022. She has also recently published chapters on Gothic eco-burial in dark scenes from Damaged Earth, the Gothic Anthropocene, and on the ambivalent relationship between the Gothic and the health humanities in 20th century Gothic, on contagious disease and fears of alternate identity, in Evolutions of Horror in the 21st century, and on literary depictions of disparity in organ harvesting and the Edinburgh Companion to the Global Gothic. So Laura, the floor is yours, and thank you again for agreeing to be with us today.
Thank you so much. I was very excited to receive this invitation. Let me just get myself set up here and share my screen. So when Agnieszka asked me to do this, I was kind of faced with a wealth of options in terms of what topic to choose. And so I've kind of gone towards breadth instead of depth in terms of what I've chosen. So what I'm going to be doing is talking about several different topics within medicine and the Gothic, touching on some of the things that she just mentioned in my bio that I have published, and hoping that some of that kind of sparks some conversation. So here we go, everyone able to see. So I'm going to begin with a scenario. A highly contagious disease that leaves many dead and others severely impacted for the rest of their lives is ravaging the world. Medical experts have devised a vaccine with little danger and high effectiveness. A campaign is launched with celebrities and politicians adding their voices to advocate for this life-saving medicine. Despite this, others, including some claiming medical expertise, speak out against the vaccine, refusing to get one themselves. I could easily be talking about the state of public health over the last 4 years and the COVID-19 vaccinations, but I'm not. Instead, I'm talking about the smallpox vaccination attributed to British physician Edward Jenner and a cow named Blossom in the late 1790s. People have been inoculating for a long time in India, China, and parts of Africa. It's a process that involves introducing a small amount of infected biological matter, typically a scab, into a healthy body by making a cut or scrape. Though fairly effective, it can also be dangerous if the immune system can't fight it off, and it does not prevent the inoculated body from being contagious. So there are obvious downsides to inoculation. But it was still better than getting full-blown smallpox. The story goes that Edward Jenner, a student of the most innovative surgeon and anatomist of London at the time, John Hunter, noticed that milkmaids who spent a lot of time around cows did not get smallpox with the same frequency that the rest of the population did. Their exposure to cowpox protected them, leading Jenner to devise a way to inoculate with cowpox instead of smallpox, leading him to use the Latin word for cow, vacca, in the new term vaccination. You can see the sun coming in through my window. There's going to be some weird light patterns on my face now, since it is afternoon for me. Vaccination was much safer and did not leave you contagious. But the idea that animal matter was involved in any type of medicine introduced to the pure, uncontaminated human body was upsetting to some, and they drew on Gothic concepts of transgression and monstrosity to convey their fears. When Jenner was promoting his newfangled smallpox vaccination method, it caused the creation of many outlandish Gothic narratives. So we got images like this by James Gilroy in 1802, in which you can see that people are being vaccinated and there are little cows kind of sprouting from all different parts of their bodies. Here's a close-up of that. And you can see kind of the horror that all these people are reacting to these tiny little cows suddenly emerging from their bodies after getting vaccinated. Gilroy uses humor, but also horror to illustrate the anxieties that fuel debates around vaccination. Dr. Benjamin Moseley was dead set against this vaccine, claiming not only that it was unsafe and would corrupt the pure human body, but it would cause unspeakable acts. So even doctors, this fellow doctor, Dr. Moseley, came out against this vaccine. He worried that, quote, British ladies might wander in the fields to receive the embraces of the bull. Such would be a threat to the purity of their humanity. Corrupt on both a physical and moral level, science then trumps the supernatural. Both are equally threatening. The Gothic again appears in an anonymous poem called The Vaccine Phantasmagoria in 1808. A phantasmagoria is a magic lantern show, a series of images and special effects that are disturbing or shocking or scary for entertainment. But it does not make vaccination into a Gothic monster, as we might expect from seeing Gilray's depiction of those cultural anxieties through those tiny little cows emerging from people's bodies. Instead, it portrays a self-consciousness that is often characteristic of the Gothic. Instead, it's poking fun of that doctor I just mentioned who was afraid of the cow kind of infesting people. It pokes fun at him and it says, we see you putting vaccination into a Gothic narrative and trying to scare us. We see these strategies that you're using. You're the one giving us nightmares about this very safe medicine, but you're the actual nightmare because you're going to cause more death by using these Gothic strategies for your own ends. So there's a layering and a borrowing of narrative forms and Gothic terminology to these medical conversations that are happening. Both sides of a medicine might be using these same Gothic languages, these same Gothic images for their own ends. So the Gothic essentially gives us a language to talk about things that scare us, and medical contexts can scare us a lot. These strategies were used to both promote and to warn about medical advances that seemed like mad science. And so my point is that the use of horror and Gothic imagery in medicine has a long history in literature, art, and popular culture. And we've seen this kind of fear-mongering making direct use of Gothic and horror language today, though I haven't heard anything necessarily about bestiality that Dr. Moseley was worried about in our current vaccine fears. It's this intersection at the center of fear and anxiety, the intersection of the Gothic and medicine, that I'd like to talk about today. For about half of this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Gothic and medicine in the Romantic period, both because that is my area of expertise, but also because I argue that medicine helped to build the foundation for the Gothic in those crucial early decades. And the second half of this talk, I will extend this intersection to various medical anxieties of our own moment and the literature and film that scares us through an understanding of them. In 1797, Samuel Taylor Coleridge writes, "Situations of torment and images of naked horror are easily conceived, and a writer in whose works they abound deserves our gratitude almost equally with him who should drag us by way of sport through a military hospital or force us to sit at the dissecting table of a natural philosopher." In this well-known passage, Coleridge compares Gothic literature, specifically Matthew Lewis's The Monk, which is, he's reviewing that book here. He is comparing Gothic literature to the most violent and gory medical spaces, highlighting their qualities of spectacle and thrill. Coleridge's ambivalent relationship with the Gothic was not atypical of Romantic poets, who desperately strove to separate themselves from the lowbrow, cheap thrills, while at the same time envying those growing audiences that the Gothic attracted. As Michael Gamer has suggested in his work on readers, writers, and reviewers of the Gothic, this reputable literature shapes what is considered to be reputable literature. The anonymous or disgraced authors of the Gothic built the Romantic canon, despite their exclusion from it. So let's begin with two anatomists. One is an accomplished physician with a background in surgery, and the other is a fictional malcontent created by an author well aware of medical innovations. While most aspects of Romantic medicine could be considered gruesome, both Matthew Bailey and Victor Frankenstein devoted their lives to the study of the macabre interior body, attracted to what they could learn from the dead and from the abnormal, the unnatural, the morbid. Through the examples of the fictional Frankenstein and historical Bailey, we can see a convergence of the medical imagination and the Gothic imagination within the context of medicine and literature in the late 18th and the late 18th and early 19th centuries. When Romantic medicine struggled to test or prove its innovative theories because of physical restraint, the Gothic transgressed the medically possible, picking up its own scalpel to experiment with the same ideas in an imaginative and disturbing space that includes the supernatural among the natural and the unnatural. Unafraid to explore the gore typical of medical experimentation to produce shock and horror, Gothic experiments expand the possibilities of medical theories by showing what they might look like in a speculative space without limits. The Gothic tradition itself, considered to be a diseased collection of unsettling, unhealthy tropes, provides access to non-normative bodies that call for or embody fluctuating medical theories. By harnessing the power of fear, the tropes applied to these bodies allow them to reclaim agency over their own treatments at a time when medical authority was itself in flux. So in other words, I argue that the Gothic literature of this time period is really acting as a laboratory for experiments to be carried out because it gives access to gory bodies, unnatural bodies, bodies that are pushed beyond the limits, othered bodies, all these other types of bodies that medicine was also really interested in. In many ways, Matthew Bailey's study of morbid anatomy both represents the irregularities of medicine and the Romantic era and mirrors the reception of Gothic literature as spectacular and marginalized. Refreshingly, Bailey is best known amongst literary critics in relation to his sister, successful dramatist Joanna Bailey, though he was well known in his time for his kind bedside manner, posh respectability, inherited surgical skill, popular lectures, and attendance on royalty. So he was a big name in the time. The Bailey siblings spent large parts of their lives in the company of famed physicians, surgeons, and anatomist brothers, William and John Hunter. So John Hunter was Jenner's instructor who taught him basically how to get to vaccination. So John Hunter is also a pretty big name in the time period. As such, Joanna became known for her medicalized mental experiments on the stage, and Matthew went into the family business, following his uncle William to become an accomplished physician with a deep knowledge of surgery. With 3 extensive medical collections at his disposal, Bailey honed a collector's eye to specialize not in healthy organs, but in diseased ones. In his groundbreaking publication, The Morbid Anatomy of Some of the Most Important Parts of the Human Body, first published in 1793 and again in 1798, and yet again with a series of engravings in 1812, he reprioritized knowledge of undesirable or diseased parts and their impact on the natural, healthy body featured in most textbooks. In other words, Bailey's greatest contribution to medicine was his insistence on the value of the morbid body. In simple terms, morbid anatomy is the study of diseased organs and their impact on the body as a whole. The first edition of the Morbid Anatomy systematically catalogs the major organs and every unusual variation of them that Bailey had seen, remarking on appearance, texture, smell, sometimes even taste. Fully engrossed in the minutiae of these separate parts, Bailey's repeated hope is that the graphic detail of his obsessively attentive catalog would lead future readers to better understand the diseases themselves and their symptoms before the patient became post-mortem. Like many medical textbooks of the time, his collection of morbid organs is essentially a record of the body's ability to elude medical understanding. But even that acknowledgement serves an important purpose. Though Bailey's textbook is admittedly incomplete, the contents that are included are classified by its title as morbid, emphasizing their exclusion from other textbooks and setting them apart as different. Pathology establishes difference through the categories of normal and abnormal that are often translated as acceptable and unacceptable, and that affect the ways bodies were and are treated. Morbid bodies need to be fixed or managed. Historically, the anatomical pathology to which Bailey's book contributed has been used to impose labels like abnormal, unnatural, or unhealthy on non-normative bodies and make judgments about their validity. Pathology attempts to negotiate with the unpredictability of the body because of its tendency to escape these categories, an escape that Romantic medical writers openly admitted in their works. Likewise, to its critics, the Gothic was considered to be a collection of unhealthy tropes that contaminated entire works of literature and indeed entire literary careers. The frequent unbelievability of its narrative cohesion leads to accusations that such tropes are contrived, superficial, weak, or unnatural. The rise of medical pathology at the end of the 18th century then provides a useful model for understanding the reaction against the Gothic novel that intensifies in the 1790s, but that continued through the first part of the 19th century and beyond. I argue that a crossover exists between the literary tradition that collects unsettling Gothic tropes and a medical approach that collects diseased organs, one of many ways in which the interplay between medicine and literature broadens conversations about the institutions, conditions, and conventions that define bodies and their disobedient parts. Because medicine during the Gothic heyday of the 1790s preceded the systemization of medicine into consistent branches or institutions that we would recognize today, there was little standardization of education, training, procedure, or mission. It was very messy, the medical market in general. The performative hierarchy of practitioners was unstable and fluid, with a university-trained physicians at the top, known for their conceptual work with the theory of medicine, surgeons in the middle, known for getting their hands dirty and for learning by doing, and apothecaries at the bottom, known for menial tasks and dispensing drugs until the Apothecaries Act added more formal training to their requirements. Despite these theoretical hierarchies, surgeons and apothecaries were often knowledgeable beyond their reputations and fully capable of making medical decisions about their patients without the blessing of a physician. Not even included in this hierarchy were the many quacks, midwives, trust makers, and bone setters who make up the extensive medical market, bringing a wide range of experiences and perspectives, not to mention treatments and fees that added more variety to the medical sphere. Finally, to this, we must add charitable public health organizations like the Royal Humane Society, prevalent self-help practices encouraged by books like William Buchan's Domestic Medicine, and self-experimentation demonstrated by scientists like Humphrey Davy. Unsurprisingly, such variety of practitioner led to a variety of diagnoses. To return to our two anatomists, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the expected place to start a discussion of unnatural bodies and their parts at the intersection of Romanticism, medicine, and the Gothic. Victor's final product may be more insidious than a successful textbook, but his methods and goals are not that different from Bailey's, and he certainly demonstrates a knowledge of and regard for medical anatomy. As a young man, Victor is a dreamer before he becomes a scientist, or rather he fails to distinguish between the two. The texts that first inspire him teach the speculative study of alchemy and scientific magic. Victor speaks of the old masters as he would mythic heroes and their tomes as he would tales of wonder. What's more, he learns to associate science with mystery and medicine with possibility. In other words, Frankenstein blurs the line between medicine and fantasy, finding merit and enjoyment in this intersection and ultimately mixing empirical methods with alchemical goals. Victor is written about in the context of medicine so frequently because he is an anomaly. While Romantic Gothic texts are riddled with clear medical influences, rarely do they revolve around actual medical practitioners or scientists in such a self-defined way. What makes this even more extraordinary is that Romantic medical figures would have been obvious candidates for Gothic characters. A broad cultural ambivalence toward anatomists, surgeons, and physicians was evident in political cartoons and pamphlets, not to mention works like Robert Southey's 1799 poem called The Surgeon's Warning, which features a surgeon afraid of what will happen to his own corpse after everything he has done to others. Some of these cultural depictions, like Thomas Rowlandson's 1815 drawing Death in the Dissecting Room of a skeleton attacking anatomists and body snatchers at their work, show a desire for revenge, and specifically Gothic revenge from beyond the grave. So there's kind of this sense that doctors are not doing good things. They're doing things that would require some kind of revenge. And that revenge is always taken in the form of the Gothic because it's the dead coming back to life. But the medical figure does not make it to the center of Gothic fiction as an antagonist or protagonist until the Victorian period. Instead, the Romantic era Gothic tropes perform the work of medicine themselves. Romantic era Gothic, in fact, offers medical experimentation without practitioners. By testing medical theories through its familiar tropes, the Gothic dismantles any fictitious system of medical authority, reallocating that authority to the body itself. So in other words, we don't really need the doctor figures that much in the Romantic Gothic works because the bodies themselves are going to do their own experimenting. A scarcity of doctors in the Romantic Gothic does not mean that there is no medical experimentation or practice going on within its text. Quite the opposite. Medical concepts become unrestricted by practitioner status or training, and even the text itself at times becomes experimental. I want to expand the classification of medical Gothic beyond the figure of the Gothic doctor or the mad scientist. The Gothic allows the body to retain its mysteries and their power by turning them into something to be feared, and it can use medical concepts to do this. Gothic literature itself, a reading and interpretation of the dead in its most gruesome and horrible states, is all but classified as the morbid anatomy of the Romantic literary tradition, unhealthy and diseased. Amid a devaluing of the Gothic by reviewers and of abnormalities by medical practitioners, the Gothic can also promote a revaluing of morbid anatomy and morbid literature. We see this in the Romantic period, and it has lasting impacts on the tradition going forward. Before moving on, I think it might be helpful to share the definition of the Gothic that I use the most often in both my scholarship and teaching. And this is probably a definition that you yourselves are aware of, but I like to put it into talks to make sure that everyone knows what I mean when I say the Gothic. I like this definition because it allows for the Gothic to transform in every time period in which it exists, and also because it ties the Gothic to medicine at a determining level. And so this is Chris Baldick's definition from the Oxford Book of Gothic Tales. I think this is 2001. And he says, for the Gothic effect to be attained, a tale should combine a fearful sense of inheritance in time with a claustrophobic sense of enclosure in space. These two dimensions reinforcing one another to produce an impression of sickening descent into disintegration. When talking about the Gothic within medical contexts, we can tweak this definition a little bit. Space is certainly important, whether the experience is the space of the body itself or spaces where the body is treated. Time is less about the past when we're talking about the body and more about the present and future in terms of inheritance of mortality. And so the idea is what is happening now, what is happening in the future, and that inheritance of mortality rather than a haunting sense that we would typically think of time meaning. And we've all seen over the past few years how the intrusion of illness into a timeline can cause a liminal limbo state that is very disturbing. And of course, I often focus on the last part of this definition, the importance of the sickening descent of something unnerving and unwell, often unseen in the system or beneath the surface of the body. The close relationship between the Gothic and unsettling medical innovation is not restricted to the Romantic period, of course. There has been a significant amount of scholarly work on Victorian medicine and Gothic literature. I'm reading Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula, with students right now, and we've talked a lot about the state-of-the-art medicine of blood transfusion and mesmerism, as well as the many ways in which the novel disturbs fin de siècle obsessions with modernity as new technology and science fail over and over, requiring archaic and superstitions to step in. These are very common ways to read Dracula, but they continue to fascinate us today. So what does the Gothic do for medicine today, and how is it influenced by 21st century, even COVID era medical anxieties? Over the last few years, we have seen an evolving concept of death and a reevaluation of medical care in the midst of global pandemic. While the total number of people killed by COVID-19 still grows every day, we also see a growing denial and callousness regarding those deaths. Numerical death counts a few years ago were intended to shock us, but instead relocated the dead to a liminal state of undeath. The body, and therefore the notion of death, is removed from them. Numbers, after all, can't die and they can't have bodies. They're just numbers. What we needed was something that would bring those bodies back. When COVID hit, the death care situation in the United States was dire, putting families who had lost loved ones through a cruel limbo in which they could not bury their dead. First, hospitals could not accept the dying, then funeral homes could not take the dead. Media stories about solutions like refrigerated trucks storing corpses outside hospital morgues in New York caused disgust and fear. Stories like these are important, however, because they interrupt the liminality, the ignorability of abstract numbers by calling attention to bodies. People can visualize a truck full of body bags, making them want to talk about it. It's creepy and it's gross and it's shocking and it's really Gothic. The Gothic, if nothing else, never ignores an unburied body, making conversations about disturbing topics possible by providing context and frame of reference. This is just one example of the liminal states of undeath caused by abstraction and sterilization that exist in the 21st century health and medical fields, which the Gothic has naturally begun to reflect and help audiences reflect upon. Amidst widespread anti-science, anti-authority sentiment, fear has become a complicated role in shaping actions and attitudes regarding public health. But at the same time, there's no denying that role is important. The Gothic reflects and articulates those fears, providing outlets to understand them and a language to talk about them. At the same time that the Gothic, because it is creepy and gross and shocking, has been responsible for associating medical conditions and situations with something to fear, creating stigma and harm, it also legitimizes and values experiences that are already fearful. And so this is a quote that I want to kind of apply to this situation. This is from the truly excellent book on transplantation Gothic that Sarah Wasson has written recently. And she writes that representations of intense distress are often seen as unhelpful by healthcare practitioners, medical humanities scholars, and disability studies scholars. Each of these three constituencies has good reason for historically discouraging, attending closely to, or dwelling on expressions of individual anguish in physical or emotional extremity. Yet, prioritizing narratives with a positive slant can mean that some people's experiences may be implicitly denigrated. So in other words, the Gothic refuses to ignore experiences simply because they're negative. In fact, those experiences are the most valuable because they show what work is needed. If witnessing those experiences helps us get to that place, we are then witnessing things that most need to be witnessed. And so the Gothic is really skilled and expert at bringing those negative medical experiences to the forefront when some groups, as Sarah Wasson points out, would rather kind of ignore them. The relationship between the Gothic and medicine is more important than ever because it can provide us with language and imagery to express and explore the anxiety of multiple forms of medical experience. So it's not really unlike those anxieties about vaccination that I spoke about just a few minutes ago. I'll now look at three of the many ways in which the Gothic draws attention to shared, often unspeakable, disturbing experiences relevant to today's medical contexts. And so the first one is contagion, something that we are all very familiar with. As pandemics and other global disasters show us, human connection has real consequences, and we cannot help but be affected or infected by one another. But they have also shown us how easy it is to dismiss suffering and loss, even on such a large scale. A recognition of connectivity can cause fear of disease, and a denial of that connectivity can cause an even more dangerous dismissal of disease. Susan Sontag writes that illness is the night side of life, a more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. And she's implying a stark divide between those two kingdoms. But Contagion disrupts that divide. Gothic fiction has historically been well situated to depict contagion because of its obsession with otherness that is revealed to be entirely manufactured and forced. It instead reveals a frightening closeness and connectivity to the other. This is especially highlighted in its contagion narratives, disease making humanity afraid of its simultaneous power and fragility. The fear of one another for reasons of contagion is not exactly new. Priscilla Wald coins the term epidemiological horror or biohorror, defined as the conventions of horror meet the dangers of contagion, as a devastating communicable disease turns the infected into predatory monsters. And of course, we're familiar with this through the contagion narrative of the zombie movie. But we don't always need to have something supernatural involved. Illness can make the human body uncanny. It makes it familiar and strange. The 2017 film It Comes at Night shows us this fear even before the pandemic, depicting a family protecting itself from illness in their fortified home before joined by another family, all in good health when they enter this safe home. Wald remarks on the tendency to demonize the carrier, that is, to attribute the traits of the supernatural, animated, sinister microbe to its human host. One of the most prominent jump scares in this film is someone shouting, "There's somebody in the house." The invisible medical threat and the carrier become conflated, highlighting the fear of the living and the complex system of blame aimed at those who may at any moment cause death just by breathing. So the thought that there's somebody unknown in the house and you don't know what disease they're carrying is counted as a jump scare, as a horror trope, even though it is a very simple medical concept. We see these developments in literature as well. Gothic texts about contagion have been shifting in the 21st century toward fear of disease and the complex contradictory relationship between community and isolation that witnessing contagion reveals. They are not only highlighting the fear that we cannot control our own vulnerable bodies, but also the severe mental states, trauma, rage, repression caused by a yearning for connection and comfort, but a fear of others. So we have this simultaneous need for others, but also a fear of others. Whereas earlier periods may have applied superstition and the supernatural to medical crises, and the 20th century may have used zombies to convey concerns about contagion, connection, and isolation, I'm arguing that the 21st century is beginning to move away from that narrative shield to legitimize these states on their own, but it's not doing it all at once. It's kind of creeping towards that trend. Two recent novels, one that came out during the pandemic and one that directly addresses it, are Survivor Song by Paul Tremblay and Last One at the Party by Bethany Clift. Survivor Song inherits in aspects of the zombie in a story about a fast-acting form of rabies among humans, in a sense that the characters understand this purely medical threat through a shared cultural understanding of the typical zombie narrative. So people are getting rabies, and instead of treating them as sick patients, they are referring to them as zombies, even though there is no supernatural element whatsoever in this story. But they need that narrative to understand what's going on. Last One at the Party shows an evolution beyond the need for the zombie comparison in order to legitimize fearful medical experiments or experiences. In this novel, all except a mysterious few succumb to a fast-acting, painful, and violent disease that leads to mass deaths that combine horror and comfort. Horror of what the body is capable of doing. So it's a very horrific disease. But also comfort in that everyone kind of knows they're going to die. So they are able to kind of stop everything and find comfort with loved ones or in places that they love. So everyone's kind of able to choose who they're going to be with and where they're going to die. So a very dual kind of emotion in this novel. Instead of zombie monsters, disease is as horrifying as it is, and it needs to be. So the disease itself is enough to become a horror trope. In its characteristic ambivalence, the Gothic becomes invested in the desirability of human connection when connection also becomes a source of terror and death. It Comes at Night, even more than these two novels, builds paranoia through isolation, something that Gothic has always been expert at depicting. But now it is combined with a striving after human connection through media and technology that we learn from Dracula is bound to fail, and we often expect it to fail. In the 2020 pandemic horror film Host, a group of friends gather on Zoom to perform a seance. At no point are they ever physically in the same room, yet they can hear and see each other through the reproduction of each other's voices and faces, which, though clear enough, are always distorted through the shifting quality of the technology. We, of course, are all familiar with this, and it has become part of our pandemic experience. As much as we engage with these technologies in an effort to make connection, we never really expect it to work that well, right? Zoom meetings, Zoom events are not the same as in-person meetings, in-person events. It's just not the same thing. But Host shows us that we might actually be wrong about this. The seance is successful and a spirit is raised, and it brutally attacks each participant in their own space. That connection is real, but it's not real enough for the participants to help each other. At the end of the day, terrifyingly, they are all still alone. So disease forces us to kind of experience this isolation and connection at the same time. And so the next topic I'm going to look at is trauma and caregivers. Isolation is just part of the trauma for those who are sick and those who care for them, who can become dangerously beaten down by depression, anxiety, stress, and grief. Recently, The Lancet reported that 49% of healthcare workers have suffered burnout. The sick may often face abandonment by the living, but the people who care for them face the same repeatedly. Helen Stanton Chappell notes that dying patients almost always occupy a devalued social position compared to non-dying patients. To move a patient beyond the reach of those standards to label the patient as officially dying is an act of delegitimization. They become almost undead, and by proxy, the carers who take care of them also become undead themselves. The 2019 film Saint Maud is a guide through end-of-life care and the experience of carers. In it, Amanda has lost her celebrity lifestyle and is abandoned by her friends after being diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma. Her carer, Maud, is also abandoned, first by the hospital and other nurses, and then by her own patient. Maud becomes undead via both the unappreciated role of the home carer and the trauma she experiences at the overcrowded and understaffed hospital. So we have extremes of too much community, too much crowding, and then not enough. It's extreme loneliness, two different extremes. The Gothic interpretation of Maud's experience as undead resonates with the dozens of photos of healthcare workers collapsed, exhausted in hallways that we have seen over the last few years. At the same time that the hospital experience fails Maud, we do still need that regulation of the hospital. At the same time, in Misery, Annie Wilkes is the obvious villain. She's an ex-nurse who left the hospital under suspicious circumstances, but she never really gives up nursing in her own home. She kidnaps her favorite writer and uses all manner of medical manipulation on him. While horror and the Gothic are often concerned with critiquing the inhumanity of the medical system, Annie shows us that we need that system and the ethical checks and balances that it offers. When nurses go rogue, bad things happen. There's absolutely no problem with Annie's medical care. She knows what she's doing and she is attentive to a fault. But without the institution of medicine, her ability to make ethical decisions about her patients becomes lost in delusion and obsession. So this text reminds us that we need the system, that it cannot be dismantled, only reformed. The medical system fails to care for both Maud and Annie, and their patients suffer because of it. And so the Gothic, even though it is typically in a position to critique these larger medical systems, it still often shows us that we cannot abandon them. So it's kind of that old idea of the Gothic novel as a conservative novel. It's going to show us something innovative, but then everything is going to return to the status quo at the end. So it's really kind of playing with kind of showing us things and then taking them away. And then my final topic that I will be touching on is that of organ harvesting. And this may seem like a relic of the past. This may seem like it's no longer relevant, but I can assure you it is disturbingly alive and well. Organ transplant, specifically organ harvesting, is ambivalently represented in Gothic narratives. The most obvious Gothic text to turn to here is Coma, both the 1977 novel and the 1978 film, which is about a medical resident investigating a recurrence of coma in the hospital. And she discovers that people are being intentionally put into comas in order to send them to this dehumanizing storage facility where their organs are harvested and sold to the highest bidder anywhere in the world. At the end of the novel, Robin Cook himself, a surgeon, includes an author's note claiming that this novel was conceived as entertainment, but it is not science fiction. Intending to scare people into becoming organ donors to lessen the need for the so-called red market, his novel had the opposite effect of convincing readers that hospitals would find any excuse to harvest and sell their organs. So he meant to have a positive impact on organ donation, but what this book does and what it shows us that the Gothic and horror can have unintended effects is that it scared people away from becoming organ donors, furthering the under the table red market or black market for organs. There are currently around 107,000 people in the US waiting for organ transplants right now, and 17 people on that list die every day, according to both the Health Resources and Services Administration and the United Network for Organ Sharing. So this is a huge problem and a huge source of horror in many ways. This medical thriller caused lasting damage to human health, as many are still reluctant to become organ donors for fear doctors will not save their life and will save their organs instead. Though the movie makes a big deal of the weird storage facility, I argue that there are two more significant horrors in both versions. One is that this is not a criminal operation on the outskirts of society. This is orchestrated by the chief of surgery, who egotistically believes that what he is doing is for the good of the hospital and medical advancement. The chief of surgery justifies this by saying, sometimes there are situations where, what should I say, the common folk, if you will, cannot be depended upon to make decisions which will provide long-term benefits. The common man thinks only of his short-term needs and selfish requirements. And by the way, the common man is the reader. And so that's meant to kind of set off alarm bells for the reader as kind of a source of Gothic horror. He neglects to mention, of course, that the selling of those organs he's harvesting are going to the highest bidder. So this is an economic transaction, not a miracle cure. Along these lines, the second horror in Coma is the consistent treatment of patients as numbers on a chart or as part of the machine keeping them alive in the intensive care unit. And so the parts in the novel that are most terrifying are kind of the everyday medical experiences, showing us how frequently fear is part of just a regular hospital visit. Attempts by the main character to treat patients as human are referred to as feminine weakness. Thus, at the same time that the novel and film attach fear to a life-saving procedure for decades to come, it also exposes examples of dehumanization in everyday care. In addition to Coma, two dystopian novels, Never Let Me Go, a 2005 British novel by Kazuo Ishiguro, and The Unit, a 2006 Swedish novel by Ninni Holmqvist, further demonstrate valuing and devaluing of bodies for their organs. Never Let Me Go is about clones who are raised for the sole purpose of donating their biological material for people who are not clones. The clones are not allowed to serve any other purpose except that of caring for each other as they go through their donations, which is the organs they're forced to give. In the unit, anyone who reaches a certain age and is still single and childless is rounded up and sent to the unit, where they will be subjected to medical experiments while also donating their biological material for those who are more needed in society. While both novels are full of the language of donation, these are instances of organ harvesting because of the deep psychological coercion that goes into maintaining these systems and convincing these groups that they are dispensable, that their lives are worth less than those of others. No violence is needed, but I would never call these circumstances of consent. These deeply unsettling inequalities are indicative of fears about early organ transplants in, again, the 60s and 70s, questions about who deserves organs and who should give them up. In fact, according to Emily Russell, the first successful heart transplant occurred in Cape Town. In one early case, an organ crossed apartheid boundaries. The heart from a man considered to be of mixed race was transplanted into the body of a white man. It was pointed out that that man's heart could now go places that the rest of the body, while alive, never could. The organs of the clones and the dispensables, and that's actually the term used in the unit, is they are dispensables, are valued in ways the individuals are clearly not, and they are clearly preying on groups that are already marginalized. And so these novels use Gothic imagery and conventions to show us what this kind of inequality looks like without attaching any one marginalized group to it. So these are very teachable. I've taught these before, and you can put them alongside any other of a number of instances in which marginalized groups are subjected to the same types of experimentation and coercion. Clones are dispensable, but could stand in for any number of populations considered to be more expendable than others. These types of disparities in organ harvesting and medicine much more broadly continue to occur today and every day. And so I could continue to go on with my examples. There are many, many medical crises beyond the current pandemic that the Gothic has begun to embrace. I'm going to be beginning a project on the Gothic and dementia and aging, but there's also mental illness and cancer and healthcare costs and insurance. The medical Gothic continues to help us to understand the state of healthcare and the human experience more broadly. And so I'm going to stop there. Here are a lot of my references. And I'm happy to share any references that anyone would find useful. And I will stop there for questions.
Thank you so much, Laura. This was amazing and quite close to my own research. I was kind of laughing when I saw the quote from Sarah Wasson on the kind of because it's
such a good book. I speak highly of that book any chance I can. It's a great book. It's
a great book, and I just used this quote like a couple of days ago. It was like, yes, this is kind of amazing. And
yes.
We have some comments in the chat section more about the kind of maybe different examples. So Camille is asking about well, the kind of Universal's Frankenstein from 1931. So just for the sake of recording, I will read it out. So I understand that here abnormal is just a descriptor, but I find it interesting that in Universal's Frankenstein, Victor uses abnormal brain when in the book there was barely any focus on the body parts itself, which I think is a kind of nice observation that this is something that was added to the Frankenstein lore a bit later, right? And and
if I could just kind of comment on that, I think part of that is, so in Frankenstein, we have in the novel, we have Victor actually at one point saying, I'm not going to tell you any details about how I did this because I don't want you to do it. And so we have kind of that hoarding of knowledge that makes it maybe even more fearful. And we see that a lot in kind of that time period, that kind of withholding of knowledge. So it's falling into that kind of fragmented manuscript trend that we see in the Gothic.
I think we also had a comment about 28 Days Later in connection to the last one at the party, kind of similar post-apocalyptic narratives of, kind of people alone in the post-apocalyptic reality. But there's also a question about organ harvesting when Camilla is asking about the adaptations of the Reanimator and the kind of difference between, perhaps, as I understand it, between the kind of coma, Never Let Me Go, and the type of medicine presented there versus Reanimator, and why those examples are perhaps better to talk about organ harvesting than Reanimator.
Yeah, I guess Reanimator, I don't see so much as an organ harvesting text. I mean, that's kind of using the whole body for other purposes, right? So organ harvesting is something horrible. And I published on this recently, and it was one of the most difficult topics I've ever had to research because it's still going on. And organ harvesting is kind of tricking people or convincing people to give up their organs so that they can be used for other people's body, so they can be given to other people. Whereas Reanimator, the bodies are already dead. I believe. So that seems more like a body snatching situation to me, even though, of course, it falls into kind of a mad science fraud category.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what Camille added, that,
Oh,
Mad
yes,
Science
exactly.
movie. Yeah, exactly. And with Comma and the rest, you have also the kind of impersonal medical slash industrial complex, right? That is taking
Oh,
over
yes.
the function of
Mm-hmm.
individual doctors and scientists.
Mm-hmm.
So before we open, I mean, the chat is open. So if you have any questions, please do. I do have a question, so I would like to start because I have the mic on. I was very interested in what she said about the kind of liminal state of undeath when you were talking about
Mm.
the kind of how the uh, let's say turning people's deaths into numbers is kind of
Mm-hmm.
making them undead in a sense that they are not recognized as dead. And I was wondering about any other examples that you might kind of
Yeah. Um, you mean a fictional example or a real life example? I mean, I'm thinking about
either.
what's happening right now, the violence happening right now, kind of worldwide, and we're so Israel and Palestine. So that immediately jumps to mind is how many bodies every day we kind of see in the headlines. That I don't know how much it affects us anymore because we're just so used to seeing numbers of bodies. And so those numbers, it's just so hard to hide the bodies in those numbers, I feel like. So I don't know if that's the kind of example that you're thinking of.
No, I was also thinking about kind of because turning people's deaths into numbers would be kind of one example of that, and we can
Mm-hmm.
see that in the kind of news coverage of Palestine and the Ukraine as well. But
Mm-hmm.
I was also wondering about burial practices, perhaps, like, like
Mm.
the if this could be something that also brings about the kind of liminal state of undeath, that people are not, kind of considered, I don't know, maybe not dead. Maybe I'm kind of I need to search for better expression here. I was just kind of wondering about the rise of kind of full eco burial practices, that people are kind of tricked into thinking that that they're going to
Mm.
be turning into trees and
Oh
whatnot, and
yeah.
and this
Mm-hmm.
is really not that ecological at all.
No, no.
So yeah, so I
It's
was kind of thinking about, could that be this kind of liminal state of undeath? Like the death is not really the
ah,
end because you're turning into a tree, but this is actually,
right.
I don't know.
I think it might be related. I think it's slightly different. What I was talking about with the numbers is I think that the numbers are being used to try to emphasize how many people are dying, right? Like the numbers are large, and so they're being used to kind of emphasize how many bodies, but it's having kind of the reverse effect. So whatever it's trying to do, it's not doing. And in that sense, yes, I would say that this kind of greenwashing that we see of the funeral industry it's trying to trick us into doing something that is not the case. Um, in that case, I'm not sure that. So with the numbers, I argue that we need to kind of bring a sense back to the body so that we realize, okay, these are all people with lives who are being lost. Um, Whereas I'm not sure that's the same problem with the eco burial. So I see what you're saying, but I think they're related, but maybe a little bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, do we have other questions, perhaps from the audience?
Maybe I can jump with a question. And I would like to go to the very beginning of your talk,
Sure.
which I really enjoyed, by the way, and about this connection between vaccination and bestiality. Because I never thought about, the etymology of the word vaccine, so that was really interesting. But also, like, I'm thinking about the anti-vax movement and this whole notion of how the new type of vaccine, this mRNA, will kind of transform us into not humans. I don't know.
Yes.
Do you think it's the same
Yes.
thought process?
Yes, I do. I think it's just history repeating itself, and we think it feels really new to us. It feels like it hasn't happened before, but it really is exactly the same thing that was happening before. You had, you know, people of all different statuses. You have medical professions like this Dr. Mosley that I quoted. He's the one who is like really kind of sensationalizing, oh, you know, if you take this vaccine, you're going to have cow something or other. You're going to be attracted to cows. You're going to be like half animal. It's like ridiculous. But it's fear mongering, right? It's the same kind of fear mongering. So it's the same strategy, same technique, same anxieties about putting something in our bodies that we don't understand, which, you know, is a legit fear that the everyday person does not understand how vaccines work. And there's no reason that they should be expected to. And so you understand where that fear is coming from. And so you see people kind of capitalizing on it from all walks of life. Yeah.
Okay, if I may, I also I'm reading the chat right now, and I'm gonna read the comment. The mention of Dracula and blood transfusion and also vaccines earlier reminded me about how in Bloodborne, the blood of eldritch monsters is both used as a panacea, but also can transform you into a monster. I'm not familiar with Bloodborne, so I would like to, I don't know, either ask Joanna for elaboration or you for a comment.
I'm not familiar with it either.
So I don't know. In the meantime, while we're waiting for elaboration, any other
I think
questions?
I think it's a series of games, or maybe one game from a couple of years ago. It's a Gothic game that also has a lot of Lovecraftian elements. I think one thing that we can maybe take from the comment, and maybe Laura, you could talk a little bit more about it, is this kind of duality of blood, and because it can, as we're kind of seeing here, but also in Dracula, blood can be used to kind of age transfusions, but at the same time, blood is also the agent that carries the substance that carries the agent of vampirism in Dracula. And there's so much blood in Dracula, and like there, in different configurations, right? So there's definitely a lot of blood work, and so maybe this duality is something that you would like to comment on.
I mean, I think it's the same fine line between, you know, need for connection, but fear of connection when we're talking about contagion more broadly. So kind of one desirable thing, one dangerous thing kind of put side to side. Blood is the same way. So when I was just talking to my students about the blood transfusions, we were talking about what they knew and what they didn't know in this time period. They did not know anything about blood types in this time period. That was coming up. That was about 10 years down the line. They would learn more about blood types. And so to get a blood transfusion was really, really risky because maybe it's a blood type that's compatible with yours. Then you're great. Then that's going to help you a lot. If it's not, that could kill you. And so that dual giving of life, giving of death is possible, not just in a vampire story, but in a medical story where you give a transfusion. And so, I think that walking that line that is mentioned in the comment about transforming you, but also being something really healthful, we see that the Gothic always kind of teasing us with that good thing, but then offering the bad thing alongside it.
So the comment on blood kind of got me thinking about, well, miscegenation and kind of thing, and also with Dracula you have the whole kind of anti-Semitic and the kind of Eastern European vibe there, which is connected to blood and the way Dracula is described kind of physically. But I was also wondering about the kind of the time period that you started with, so the kind of late 18th century, which is also the moment where the kind of modern conceptions of racism are developed, through classificatory systems in biology or kind of in natural sciences, let's call it. And I was kind of wondering how, it's a big question, so I'm not sure what you can take from it, but I was kind of wondering about how race comes into play when you think of late 18th century, the rise of Gothic and the rise of modern medicine. Like, what's the if we think of it as a triangle and the race is the third one, or racism, or racialized bodies. So like, what can we take from that?
I mean, especially in British literature, which I'm working on, I mean, they are still working on abolition of the slave trade too. So they are thinking about race a lot. They are thinking about slavery a lot. And so we see a lot of that language in Frankenstein. Actually, we see a lot of connection between the patient and the subject and the experimenter. Who has power, who doesn't have power. And so I see a lot of connection between that powerful powerlessness happening in those early texts. I would say I see more of that connection with race a little bit later, like a little bit more in maybe the beginning of the 19th century, especially when we start bringing evolution into the conversation, like 1850s. Then we really see the beginnings of scientific racism, or the scientific, of here are the different races, here's why they are superior, those kinds of ideas connected to evolution. And so I would say the earlier texts are a lot more concerned with the idea of slavery, the who has control over another person's will, who has another control over another person's labor, that we see kind of coming through in the relationship between medical practitioners and maybe even bringing this back to body snatching, and what bodies do they have access to? What bodies are they privileged to take advantage of? What bodies do they feel like are not worth protecting in any way? You had a lot of physicians and surgeons who were trying to get people to donate their bodies to science. They needed bodies really badly in this time period for teaching, for learning, for experimentation. And so you had a lot of surgeons and physicians saying, hey, look, I'm doing it. I'm going to donate my body. But the records that we have of the bodies that were dissected, those bodies, the ones who were physicians and surgeons, were treated with so much more respect than bodies that they were getting any way that they could, because a family member wasn't protecting them, because they didn't have money for a proper burial. And so this is kind of straying a lot from your question, but I'm seeing a lot more of that kind of disparity happening in those ways, and maybe that biological race happening a little bit later in the Victorian period.
Yeah, and I think this is also a question of kind of class kind of coming into play in British context, perhaps more than in the American context, where you have, I don't know, white scientists experimenting on Black women, to further gynecology, and that's something that is not really happening in the UK at the time because of the kind of different historical context. But we do have a question. Thank you for that, and thank you for talking about slavery as well in the kind of early abolitionist movement. It's kind of it's something that I haven't thought about, and I think I should go back to Frankenstein. So there is a question from Camille. I'm going to read it out now. I know it's not literature, but the theories around Jack the Ripper always seem to revolve around medical professionals, and it makes me wonder if it's just a coincidence or projecting of interest on the part of the British public.
That's a great question. And I don't know that I know enough about Jack the Ripper. I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of that was one of the few clues that they had, was they still don't know who Jack the Ripper was. They thought it was probably a medical profession, and ironically, I suspect that was because of the skill being used in the awful kind of mutilations that they discovered, and the late Victorian kind of admiration for surgeons. So, I mean, the instinct to answer this question is that people hated medical professionals, and so they're going to say they're criminals. But I actually think it works in the reverse way. This way is that they actually really admired medical professions as able to do kind of this really skilled work in a way that was not seen in earlier periods. And so my suspicion is that is one of the things that was kind of coming into play in terms of their suspicion that, okay, we see something really complicated happening, and so it must be a skilled person, because the skilled people are far above us. We don't understand what they do, but we know that it's skilled. In other words, I don't know if that answer makes much sense.
I think it's a really nice reversal of how we think about Jack the Ripper, and especially in its kind of popular pop culture manifestations, right? Because all the things I've read and seen in the last 20 years about Jack the Ripper, they all point to kind of medical, mad scientists / I don't know, deviant anatomists, right? So there's a kind of like a strong undercurrent of this, and So yeah. Okay. Do we have any other questions? I have loads of questions, and but I think I should kind of keep most of them for like a private session with Laura, not to kind of bring them all out here. Maybe just like one quick question at the end. I was really kind of interested in the section when you talk about morbid anatomy and how this, in a sense, became a kind of founding text for modern medicine, like perhaps paradoxically so, right? Because it was like morbid anatomy, like outside of the normative anatomy. But then, 200 years later, you go to a medical professional, to a doctor, and all they kind of asking about is your pathologies, right? Like, like what's wrong with you? Like, there's, the focus is not on, I don't know, preventing diseases or on your well-being in general. It's like, what's going wrong and what might be the reason for that wrong stuff happening to your body. So there's a definite kind of focus on pathology. And I don't know if you could maybe comment a little bit more on that, how it came to be that, that it's the kind of morbid pathology, morbid anatomy or pathology that became the sole focus of modern medicine, which is something that, kind of is very much entwined with the Gothic.
Yeah, and I think it has to do with so much was in flux in this period. And this is why I find the late Romantic period so interesting to study in this term, or the late 18th century rather, because it's usually a period that is not really studied in terms of medicine and the Gothic. And it goes back to what I was saying about how messy it is. Like there really is no standardization of anything. It's kind of every person for themselves in terms of finding a doctor or finding a cure or finding a diagnosis. And so I think this is the time period where we're getting those classifications. And those classifications, I think, are really what allowed the development that you're describing to happen. And so as we go into the Victorian periods, the Victorians were obsessed with classification and organization. And so if we can say, rather than, okay, let's learn what a body is supposed to look like, which is, all the textbooks that we have about perfect bodies, let's then say, okay, here are the perfect bodies, here are the non-perfect bodies, here are the unnatural bodies. Let's put these all into categories. And so we have a rise in specialization in the 19th century that we didn't have in the 18th century. 18th century medical practitioners were kind of a jack of all trades. They would do a little bit of everything. And so I think with specialization comes more interest in different pathologies. And so you can specialize in a particular form of morbid anatomy, whereas before you had to cover so many different things. Let's just focus on what it's supposed to look like. And then we can cover multiple, more ground, if that makes sense. So I think it's that specialization really that leads to the allowance that we can now say, okay, what's wrong with you? Let's send you to this particular type of doctor.
Yeah, this is super interesting. Like when you think of classificatory systems at the kind of appearing at the end of 18th century and then beginning of 19th century, they're all focused on the kind of normative, let's say, bodies or forms, right? Be it, I don't know, human races or plants, right? And then you have this kind of switch in medicine, to, as you said, the kind of specialization forces people to focus on or kind of moves them to those, let's say, pathological alleys, right? That they are supposed to kind of focus on the pathology. So it kind of makes sense, but it's also interesting how the classificatory systems kind of work, right?
It's super interesting. And even like morbid anatomy, the textbook, and it's very dry. I have read it. It is a textbook. So it is a list of just here are all the things. But you often get Bailey's commentary too. Like he'll be describing something, what it looks like, and he uses very descriptive language when he talks about what something looks like and the consistency of things. But he also will sometimes just think out loud and be like, I don't know how to classify this. It looks like it's not right, but it doesn't seem to be hurting the person. So does that mean that it is morbid anatomy because it's not supposed to be like that? But if it's not causing any harm, then what difference does it make? And so we hear him like thinking out loud a lot about how to actually classify things. And I think that's also something really unique that you don't get as much in the later periods when things are standardized. There's less a fear of revealing uncertainty or revealing that you're not sure or revealing that you're kind of just speculating in that period, which is almost literary in a sense.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. Well, okay, I don't see any new comments in the comment section. I don't see any raised hands. So I think, oh, no, there is
there's a long one.
Okay, yes, all right, so let's read it. So from Karina, speaking about Jack the Ripper, I think the reason for suspecting him of being a surgeon, apart from the level of skill he showed, were the circumstances that surround his killings. The area didn't have many street lights. The roads were very narrow, with many blind ends. So the time frame he had for each victim was very short. So it was presumed that he had to be confident in his knowledge of anatomy and his skill, which weren't publicly available if he weren't a surgeon. Yes.
Yeah,
so kind of coming back to the surgeon theory. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that, Karina. All right, okay. I think we can call it a night or a day in your case. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you everyone for staying with us so long after everyone's classes. And thank you again, Laura. This was super fascinating, and I will definitely get back to you and ask a couple more questions on the organ harvesting and transplantation, because that's something I'm working on right now. So thank you again, and thanks everyone for coming. And I hope to see some of you in person next month in the beginning of December for a workshop, I think, on games. Games. Yes, games. That's whose titles I don't remember because I'm not a gamer. But there will be games. There will be medicine and weird stuff happening in those games. So please bear with me.
If I'm not mistaken, it's supposed to be To the Moon game and something about altering memories.
Okay. All right. Okay. That thing by one of our students. Okay, so thank you again, and I hope everyone has a pleasant evening, and in case of Laura, also a pleasant day. So thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.